The desert heat still clung to him. His uniform was dust-stained, his pride even more so. Captured in North Africa, he had been marched to the coast under the watchful eyes of American guards, herded with hundreds of other prisoners onto a transport ship that groaned across the Atlantic. He expected the worst. Every man among them did. Rumors passed between them in low voices. "The Americans will starve us," one muttered. Another whispered about hard labor, chains, perhaps even torture. In their minds, captivity in enemy hands meant humiliation and cruelty. They had seen what happened when Russians took prisoners, and though no one said it aloud, fear of vanishing into silence haunted them all. The ocean voyage dragged on. Days melted into nights, and the sound of the ship's engines became the rhythm of their captivity. The prisoners clung to one another, waiting for the moment the hatches opened to reveal a land alien and hostile. But when at last the vessel creaked into an American harbor, the shock was immediate. No rubble, no bombed-out skyline. Instead, neat rows of houses, factories that hummed with life, children on bicycles riding along the waterfront. America, untouched by war. Trains carried them inland, deeper into the heart of a country they had only seen on propaganda maps. They passed fields bursting with crops, towns with theaters still lit at night, shops displaying goods that Europe hadn't seen in years. To men who had fought through rationing, scarcity, and endless ruin, this was like traveling into a dream. But inside, each prisoner steeled himself. They knew the moment was coming. Soon the gates would slam shut. Soon the barbed wire would rise around them. When the trains halted, guards ordered them off. They were marched through towering wooden gates, past fences, into a place that was, by all appearances, nothing like a dungeon. Barracks stood clean and orderly. Kitchens gave off the scent of bread and stew, and a soccer field stretched in the distance. A few men allowed themselves to breathe again. Perhaps captivity here would not be as brutal as they had feared. Still, nothing could have prepared them for the true shock. The moment came quietly, almost without announcement. A door opened, and stepping into the camp office was something none of them expected to see. A woman. She wore a pressed uniform, her hair pinned neatly beneath her cap, her posture confident. She carried a clipboard in one hand, a pistol holstered at her side. She was not a visitor, nor a civilian who had wandered in. She belonged there. She was part of the camp's staff. The prisoners froze. Conversations died in mid-sentence. Men who had faced tank battles at Kasserine Pass, who had endured the scorching sands of El Alamein, now stood stunned into silence at the sight of a woman in authority. This was not Germany. This was not the world they knew. In the Reich, women were mothers, wives, symbols of the home front. They were not officers, not administrators of men, certainly not wielders of power in a prison camp. Yet here she was, moving among them with a confidence that suggested she feared nothing. One prisoner whispered to another, "Impossible." Another looked down in shame, unwilling to meet her eyes. For some it was humiliation. For others, an awakening. For all, it was disbelief. The voice of memory recalls it. What shook us most was not the food, not the freedom of movement, but the sight of women inside our prison. The journey of those prisoners was not a coincidence. It was the result of deliberate planning by the Allies. By 1943, the war in North Africa had turned decisively against Germany. Entire divisions surrendered under the blazing sun, their strength broken, their supply lines cut. The Allies now faced a problem: what to do with tens of thousands of German captives. Britain was already straining under the weight of bombings and shortages. Its prison facilities were limited, its people still rationing every crumb. The Soviet Union was not an option, for German soldiers sent east rarely returned, and their fate was sealed in frozen gulags. The United States, with its untouched homeland, vast resources, and secure distance from the front lines, became the natural answer. Thus began one of the least known yet most astonishing episodes of the war, the mass transfer of German POWs across the Atlantic. By the end of the conflict, more than 370,000 German prisoners of war would be held on American soil, scattered across more than 700 camps in nearly every state. From the plains of Texas to the pine forests of Minnesota, from the deserts of Arizona to the fields of the Carolinas, barbed wire compounds rose quietly, often in the shadow of small farming towns. To the Germans it was bewildering. They had been torn from the deserts of Africa, only to find themselves in places they had never imagined, places where locals had never seen an enemy soldier up close. In some towns, the arrival of the POWs was the most dramatic event of the entire war, yet what awaited them was not the horror they feared. The United States adhered strictly to the Geneva Convention, ensuring prisoners were fed, housed, and allowed certain freedoms. But the Americans went beyond the minimum. Many camps offered education, cultural activities, and even libraries stocked with German books. Prisoners were permitted to write home, to attend religious services, to play soccer on camp fields. Some were even paid modest wages for labor, money they could spend at camp canteens. For men who had been told they would be brutalized, it was almost unthinkable. One diary entry recorded the shock in simple words: "We were treated as men, not beasts. It was a humiliation to our pride, but also a relief to our hunger." The contrast with the Eastern Front was staggering. German soldiers captured by the Soviets often starved, froze, or disappeared into the abyss of Siberian labor camps. Mortality rates soared. In America, by comparison, fewer than 1% of German POWs perished, most from illness rather than mistreatment. The narrator's voice rises. The Americans followed Geneva rules, but went further than anyone expected. This generosity was not born of pure kindness. There were strategic motives at play. By treating German prisoners humanely, the U.S. hoped to encourage reciprocal treatment for American POWs held in Europe. There was also a psychological weapon hidden within it, to expose German soldiers to American abundance, democracy, and freedom, undermining the propaganda they had been raised on. And so, behind the barbed wire of those camps, the seeds of shock began to grow, not in the form of punishment or deprivation, but in the form of contradictions. Meals with meat and vegetables when Europe starved, barracks with heating while families back home huddled in the cold, and above all, an environment where even women could hold authority over German men. The stage was set for deeper disorientation, for what unsettled them most was yet to come. When the first days of captivity settled into rhythm, the prisoners began to realize just how strange their new world was. The train journeys that carried them into the interior had revealed a landscape unlike anything they expected from a nation at war. There were no ruins, no hunger etched into the faces of civilians. Instead, green farmland stretched for miles, dotted with barns, silos, and neat little houses with white fences. Children waved at the passing trains. Women hung laundry out to dry. Men drove tractors across fields heavy with crops. It was a picture that to German eyes seemed almost unreal. War had consumed Europe. Streets in Berlin reduced to rubble, food lines in every city, entire towns in flames. And yet here, across the ocean, America's war was distant. The land looked untouched, fertile, even familiar. Some prisoners whispered that it reminded them of home, Bavaria, Württemberg, the Rhineland. But home had been stripped bare, its men gone to the front, its women struggling to keep farms alive. Here, there was plenty. Inside the camps, this illusion of normality continued. Barracks stood in long rows, clean and wooden, far from the stone dungeons they had imagined. They were divided into dormitories with bunks, tables, stoves, and windows that let in the afternoon light. There were kitchens that smelled of stew and bread, fields for soccer or baseball, even makeshift schools where some prisoners attended classes taught by fellow Germans. The days followed a routine. Roll call in the morning, meals served with regularity, work assignments for those who volunteered. Some were sent to nearby farms to harvest crops, others to sawmills or road projects. For many, the chance to work meant not only a small wage, but a reprieve from boredom. The Americans even allowed concerts, theater productions, and lectures. It was as if captivity had become an unexpected continuation of community life transplanted onto foreign soil. Still, unease lingered. The barbed wire fences, the watchtowers with armed guards, the ever-present sense of being cut off from home. These were reminders that, however comfortable, this was still a prison. And yet, within that contradiction, the first real shock had already begun to take root. For many of these men, the greatest surprise was not the food, nor the barracks, nor the absence of cruelty. It was that America, though at war, looked nothing like the war-ravaged lands they had left behind. It was a world away from the front, a world still whole, unscarred, vibrant. Some found themselves staring out beyond the fences, trying to reconcile what they saw with the propaganda they had been fed. They had been told America was decadent, collapsing under chaos, ruled by greed and corruption. Yet what they glimpsed beyond the wire were tidy towns, well-fed families, and landscapes that seemed to promise a kind of stability Germany could no longer imagine. That dissonance gnawed at them, but it was only the beginning. For while the prisoners slowly adjusted to life in this unexpected world, another revelation was waiting. Something more intimate, more challenging to their very beliefs than fields of plenty or barracks of comfort. Because soon they would come face to face with a reality they had never prepared for, a presence inside those camps that broke every expectation, every cultural certainty. The presence of women. The first time it happened, it was almost casual. A door opened in the administrative barracks, and in stepped not another officer, not another American sergeant, but a woman. She wore a pressed uniform blouse, a cap set firmly on her head, and in her hand a clipboard heavy with papers. She moved with confidence, spoke with authority, and carried herself as if she belonged there as much as any soldier. For the German prisoners the moment was electrifying. Conversations fell silent. Eyes darted toward the floor, some from shame, others from disbelief. They had expected to see women on propaganda posters, idealized, smiling, mothers of the Reich, but not here, not inside the fences of an American prison camp. Yet in the United States of 1943, women were not only present in the war effort, they were indispensable. Millions had joined the workforce, filling factories and offices, serving in the Women's Army Corps, the Red Cross, and as nurses stationed on bases across the country. The manpower shortages created by war had opened doors that in Germany remained firmly shut. And so, in camp after camp, women appeared in roles the prisoners could scarcely comprehend. Some were secretaries, handling rosters and correspondence. Others were clerks, managing supplies and records. Nurses tended to sick prisoners with a calm professionalism that blurred the boundaries of enemy lines. In a few camps, women even served as guards, patrolling perimeters, keeping order, their pistols visible on their hips. To men raised under the rigid gender ideology of National Socialism, this was not just strange. It was deeply unsettling. Nazi doctrine had confined women to the roles of mother and homemaker. They were exalted for bearing children, for maintaining the hearth, for serving the nation by raising soldiers. Authority, power, public duty, these belonged to men alone. Now, behind American fences, and that worldview cracked. The enemy's women walked freely among them, the voice of history recalls, not as victims, but as keepers of order. The effect was profound. Some prisoners stared in awe, unable to reconcile the image before them with everything they had been taught. Others felt humiliation. German men, soldiers of the Reich, reduced to taking instructions from women of the enemy. Still others whispered in fascination, their curiosity stirred by this inversion of the world they knew. Letters home, when permitted, hinted at this shock. A few dared to write of American women who wore uniforms, though such words were often censored before reaching Germany. Among the men themselves, rumors spread. Who were these women? Were they real soldiers? Did Americans truly trust them with such responsibilities? The answer, they would learn, was yes. In America, women were not confined to the background. They moved openly in spaces once reserved for men, including the guarded world of POW camps. Their presence was not an anomaly, but a reflection of a society mobilized in full. For the Germans, it was as if the war had stripped away not just their weapons, but their very understanding of the social order. Captivity was no longer just a loss of freedom. It was a confrontation with an alien world where the rules of gender, authority, and power itself had been rewritten. And this clash of cultures was only beginning to deepen. To understand the depth of the prisoners' shock, one must return to the world they had left behind, the Reich itself. In Nazi Germany, the role of women had been dictated by ideology, as rigid and absolute as the iron discipline of the Wehrmacht. The regime reduced their destiny to what it called the 3 Ks: Kinder, Küche, Kirche, children, kitchen, church. Women were celebrated not for their independence or ambitions, but for their ability to bear children, to manage households, to nurture the next generation of soldiers. Medals were awarded to mothers who birthed 4, 6, or 8 children. Girls were raised in the League of German Maidens to revere domesticity as their patriotic duty. Authority in public life belonged to men alone. In the military hierarchy, women were excluded entirely. The German soldier could not imagine taking orders from a woman. Such an idea was an insult to his very identity. To him, women were protectors of the home, distant from the violence of the front, revered yet sheltered. Now imagine the jarring dissonance when those same soldiers, stripped of their rifles and uniforms, found themselves standing in line as a woman checked their names against a roster. Or when a nurse leaned over to take their temperature, carrying herself with the practiced authority of one who had tended hundreds of patients before. It was not just unusual, it was unthinkable. America, by contrast, had mobilized differently. Women had stepped into every role the war demanded. They staffed munitions factories, drove trucks, worked the fields. The Women's Army Corps, known as the WACs, put women in uniform, assigning them to clerical, logistical, and even intelligence positions. Red Cross nurses served across bases and hospitals, tending to wounded men who might once have sneered at the notion of a woman in military garb. To German prisoners, the effect was twofold. Some saw it as a sign of decadence, proof of the weakness they had been told plagued American society, where men had abandoned their rightful duties to women. Others, however, saw something else, a society in which women were not hidden, but empowered. In one diary entry smuggled back to Germany, a soldier recorded his astonishment. The Americans let their women stand in authority, and the men obey. I could not believe my eyes. Even here, behind wire, they command respect. Within the camps, reactions varied. The more conservative among the prisoners scoffed, muttering that no true soldier should bow his head to a woman. Yet others found themselves captivated, not just by the novelty, but by the confidence these women carried. For men indoctrinated since childhood that women belonged only to hearth and home, it was a living contradiction. In their silence, many wrestled with questions they dared not voice. If America trusted women with such power, what else about this enemy had they misunderstood? This clash between ideology and reality would ripple through the camps, shaping the way prisoners saw not only their captors, but themselves. The barbed wire held their bodies, but the presence of women in uniform challenged their minds. The memory of those first encounters lingers in the words of the men who lived them. They had survived capture, endured the long ocean voyage, and adjusted to life behind American barbed wire. Yet nothing unsettled them so completely as the moment they first stood face to face with women in positions of authority. One prisoner recalled walking into the camp infirmary, his arm still bandaged from a wound suffered in Tunisia. He expected a gruff American medic, perhaps a doctor in uniform. Instead, he was greeted by a nurse, her uniform crisp, her voice calm, her instructions precise. She examined his injury without hesitation, spoke to him firmly, and dismissed him with a wave of her hand. For the first time, he later admitted, I felt truly powerless, not because I was a prisoner, but because the one giving orders was a woman. Another account came from the camp office, where prisoners lined up for work assignments. Behind the desk sat a secretary in military attire, her pen moving swiftly across forms. She looked up, called names in accented German, and directed men to their posts. The silence in the room was suffocating. Hardened soldiers, men who had faced artillery barrages and stared into the desert sun, now shifted uncomfortably under her gaze. They did not know whether to salute, to look away, or to stand as rigid as schoolboys. One prisoner later confessed, it was as if the battlefield rules had been inverted. The conqueror's women now stood before us, and we had no weapon but obedience. There was a strangeness to these moments, a surreal tension. Conversations stopped when women entered a room. Jokes died on men's lips. Even whispers carried a nervous edge. To acknowledge them was to acknowledge a world turned upside down. And yet not all reactions were born of shame. Some were filled with curiosity, even admiration. A young prisoner, barely 20, wrote in his diary, I could not look away. She spoke with such certainty and everyone listened. It was as though the war had opened a door to another reality, one I had never imagined. But admiration carried its dangers. Any sign of disrespect or unwanted attention was swiftly punished by American guards. Regulations forbade fraternization, and the presence of women, while tolerated, was carefully monitored. The prisoners learned quickly that a glance too long, a comment too bold, could earn them solitary confinement. Still, the shock could not be erased. Even after weeks, the sight of women in uniform continued to unsettle them. For every order received, every medical examination endured, every document signed, they were reminded that the war had stripped them not only of their freedom, but of the very hierarchy they had believed immutable. The battlefield had been a place where men alone measured strength, courage, and dominance. Here in captivity, those rules dissolved. The conqueror's women did not bow or yield. They walked freely, commanded respect, and forced German prisoners to confront a truth they had never considered, that power did not always come dressed in the form they had been taught to expect. The presence of women inside the camps did more than surprise the German prisoners. It fractured them. The reactions varied, shaped by upbringing, personality, and the degree of loyalty each man still held to Nazi ideology. For some, it was an encounter met with silent respect. For others, it was an opportunity for boldness, a reckless curiosity that bordered on forbidden flirtation. And for many, it was nothing less than a humiliation, a daily reminder that their world had been inverted. In the barracks, whispers spread quickly. Are these real guards? One prisoner asked, incredulous. Another muttered, no army would put women in uniform. This is theater, a trick to mock us. Yet day after day, the women returned, signing rosters, patrolling fences, tending wounds, and each time the disbelief deepened. They were not illusions, not propaganda, but living proof that America operated by rules alien to the German mind. Some prisoners, especially the younger ones, treated the women with a kind of reverence. They obeyed quickly, stood straighter in their presence, and sometimes risked the briefest of smiles. Others, carried by bravado, whispered comments in German they thought would not be understood, or exaggerated their manners in attempts at gallantry. To them, the presence of women offered a spark of humanity, even playfulness, in a world otherwise reduced to monotony. But not all saw it as harmless. Older, hardened soldiers muttered about disgrace. It is beneath us, one growled, to be ordered about by the enemy's women. For them, every interaction cut like a blade, stripping away the masculine pride drilled into them since youth. One prisoner later confessed, to stand helpless while a woman in uniform judged us, it felt as if the war had taken not only our freedom, but our manhood. This divide sowed tension within the wire itself. Some mocked their comrades for owing respect or interest. Others defended the women's authority as unavoidable. Arguments flared in the barracks late at night, with voices hissing in the dark. Was it dishonor or simply survival? Rumors added fuel. Men speculated endlessly. Were these women trained soldiers? Did they know how to fire their pistols? Were they truly trusted with authority, or were they decorations placed to shame them? No clear answers came, only more uncertainty. And uncertainty, in captivity, was its own kind of torment. The psychological effect was undeniable. Each encounter chipped away at the prisoners' certainties. Their entire world had been built on order, hierarchy, and a strict vision of gender. Now, behind American fences, that structure dissolved. The humiliation was sharp, but so too was the curiosity. If women could wield authority here, what else about America was different from the lies they had been told? For some, it was a silent humiliation they endured day by day. For others, it was the beginning of a question that would linger long after the war, had they misunderstood the very foundations of society itself. Inside those fences, the clash of cultures was not just between captor and captive, it was between two visions of the world, one collapsing, the other standing before them, embodied in the steady footsteps of women who passed freely between the barracks. To the German prisoners, the sight of women within the wire was shocking, disorienting, even humiliating. But to the Americans, it was nothing remarkable at all. It was not staged, nor meant as a psychological weapon. It was simply necessity, another piece of a vast, relentless machine that kept the war effort running. By 1943, America was mobilized on a scale the world had never seen. Millions of men had been drafted into the armed forces, leaving behind factories, offices, farms, and government posts. The gap had to be filled, and quickly. Into that space stepped women, by the millions. They became welders in shipyards, riveters on aircraft assembly lines, clerks in military offices, drivers of trucks and ambulances. The United States called them the arsenal of democracy, but within its borders they were also its administrators, its caretakers, and its quiet enforcers. This mobilization did not stop at the prison camps. If a camp required clerical staff, it was often women who took those roles. If medical support was needed, it was nurses, both civilian and military, who answered. Even as guards, though fewer in number, women could be found patrolling, supervising, or managing daily order. For the U.S. Army, this was simply efficiency, the logical use of available manpower, or rather, person power. The Red Cross also played its part. Female volunteers arrived to distribute supplies, books, and comfort packages, sometimes interacting directly with prisoners. Their presence carried humanitarian weight, a signal to the world that even enemy soldiers would be treated with dignity. In American eyes, there was no scandal here. A woman behind a desk or in uniform was no different than a man in the same role. The taboo that loomed so large in German culture did not exist in the same way in the United States. The line between male work and female work had blurred, and the war had erased what remained. But within the camps, the psychological impact was enormous. The prisoners could not see the larger machinery of American society. They did not understand that these women were part of a workforce that stretched from the coal mines of Pennsylvania to the shipyards of California. They saw only the personal, the intimate, the deeply unsettling, the conqueror's women walking freely among them. And while Americans accepted this as routine, the Germans felt its sting like an insult carved into their pride. One historian put it bluntly, for the Germans it was scandal. For the Americans it was simply efficiency. That gap in perception would grow wider with every passing week, because while the women of America moved with confidence, the prisoners of Germany wrestled with disbelief. And in the uneasy silence of the barracks, their stories and rumors took on a life of their own. The shock of seeing women inside the camps was one thing, but hearing their voices, firm, commanding, sometimes even casual, was another matter entirely. For many German prisoners, the first true jolt came not from a passing glance, but from the moment a woman gave them an order. Archival records describe the confusion. A young secretary in Texas, tasked with roll call, stood before a line of prisoners and read names in her crisp Midwestern accent. The men stood stiff, their faces rigid with disbelief. One whispered in German, "Sie scherzen doch." "A woman? You must be joking." Yet she continued, unshaken, and the men had no choice but to respond. In other camps, female clerks were assigned to distribute work details or handle records. Prisoners who had fought at El Alamein or Stalingrad now stood in line as a woman checked their names and assigned them to pick fruit, repair fences, or clean barracks. It was a quiet humiliation, not enforced with violence, but with something even more powerful, the authority of normalcy. But not every interaction was hostile. In some places, politeness emerged, tentative, careful, yet undeniably human. A POW in Colorado remembered being surprised when a nurse asked about his health in broken German. He answered haltingly in English, both embarrassed and strangely touched. Another recalled how Red Cross women brought books and records, allowing men to listen to music that reminded them of home. For a brief moment, the wire fence between captor and captive seemed thinner. Still, tensions occasionally flared. A small but telling number of prisoners refused to obey instructions given by women. One German sergeant flatly declined to follow a work assignment from a female clerk, demanding a male officer instead. He was reprimanded, and the punishment was mild compared to what he would have faced under the Gestapo. Yet the incident echoed through. The barracks? A story told and retold. I will not take orders from a woman. Such moments revealed the cultural chasm between the two worlds. The Germans clung to their rigid hierarchies, their belief that authority was inherently masculine. The Americans, by contrast, saw no such boundary, and each interaction, whether a respectful nod, an awkward silence, or a muttered refusal, added fuel to the fire of disbelief. The result was a strange duality. To the prisoners, these encounters were moments of humiliation and fascination. To the women, they were routine, another part of their daily work. But as the war dragged on, these brief exchanges began to carry a deeper weight. For the Germans, they became evidence of a society utterly alien to their own. For the Americans, they were proof that the world could bend and reshape itself under pressure. And within that uneasy meeting, another truth emerged, that victory in war was not only measured in battles, but also in the quiet, unseen ways one culture could unsettle another. Back in Germany, the Reich painted a very different picture of its captured soldiers. In the official line, German men taken prisoner by the Allies were still depicted as stoic warriors, respected, even feared by their captors. They were shown as men who upheld discipline, even in defeat. But the truth, buried behind oceans and censors, was far more complicated. Inside America's camps, women carried clipboards, issued orders, and kept the system running. Yet this was a detail the Nazi propaganda machine could never afford to acknowledge. For if word spread that German soldiers, men indoctrinated from youth to see themselves as masters, were now bowing their heads to women, it would cut at the very heart of Nazi ideology. It would not just be a defeat of armies, but of identity itself. The Ministry of Propaganda, under Joseph Goebbels, was acutely aware of such dangers. Every scrap of information leaving the camps was carefully filtered. Letters home were screened, censored line by line. A prisoner might write about the good food or the relative comfort of his barracks, but if he mentioned a woman giving him orders, the sentence would be struck out with black ink, or the letter would never reach Germany at all. And yet, whispers still traveled. Some POWs managed to slip vague allusions into their correspondence. One letter intercepted by censors contained the phrase, "They live strangely here, even the women." The rest was scratched away, deemed too dangerous. Another hinted at the humiliation without stating it directly. Life here is orderly, though it is not always men who command it. For the German state, the stakes were high. Admitting the presence of women in positions of authority would have undermined the regime's carefully constructed narrative of gender. Women, in Nazi ideology, were mothers, wives, and bearers of the next generation, not clerks in uniform, not guards walking freely among soldiers. To reveal otherwise would have been a kind of ideological collapse, proof that their enemies were not only stronger on the battlefield, but in the structure of society itself. Thus, silence was enforced. Inside Germany, newspapers spoke only of the barbarity of Soviet captivity or the hardships under the British. American camps were rarely mentioned, and when they were, the tone was dismissive, as if nothing of note occurred there. The image of women mingling with German soldiers, sometimes commanding them, sometimes befriending them, was buried beneath propaganda's iron curtain. But inside the camps, the truth lived on in memory. Men talked among themselves, retelling encounters with both embarrassment and fascination. They knew these were stories they could never send home, tales that would never appear in the fatherland's papers. And so they became an underground narrative, whispered in barracks at night, shared in secret between men who knew they had witnessed something their leaders would never acknowledge. For the Reich, this secrecy was necessary. For the prisoners, it was maddening. And for history, it became one of the strangest, most hidden truths of the war. The quiet scandal of German men living under the authority of American women. For all the tension, for all the whispers of humiliation and disbelief, there were also moments that unsettled the Germans in an entirely different way. Not through shame or loss of pride, but through kindness. Because in many camps, the women they saw were not guards or clerks, but nurses. A German corporal captured in Tunisia, suffering from malaria, later recalled the moment an American nurse leaned over his cot to take his temperature. She spoke no German, he spoke little English, yet the gentleness of her touch startled him. He had expected indifference at best, cruelty at worst. Instead, he saw care in her eyes, and, what shocked him most, a trace of lipstick, the faintest sign of femininity, in a place he thought would be stripped of it. The enemy, he later said, wore lipstick and a smile. This scene repeated itself across America's prison camps. Nurses treated infected wounds, dispensed medicine, and sometimes sat briefly with the men as they recovered. To German soldiers raised on Nazi propaganda, the image of women as fragile homemakers and of enemies as merciless brutes, the experience was disarming. Here were women who not only walked freely among them, but who knelt at their bedside, adjusted their bandages, and asked in broken German or accented English, "Wie fühlen Sie sich? How do you feel?" Many prisoners found themselves torn. Their pride told them to reject it, to see this as another insult, that even their suffering was tended to by women. Yet their humanity told them otherwise. Letters and memoirs that survived the censors record a stunned gratitude, a realization that these women did not see them as monsters, but as men in need of care. One prisoner wrote years later, "I could not understand it. She had a brother, perhaps, fighting against us, yet she smiled at me." It was a subtle but powerful breach in the wall of ideology. The German state had told them that enemies were inhuman, incapable of compassion. Instead, they found that compassion came most often from women, the very figures their own regime insisted should remain silent, powerless, invisible beyond the home. Such encounters did not turn them into friends, nor erase the fact of captivity, but they left imprints in memory. In the quiet of the infirmary, the sharp clash of cultures softened into something else, the recognition of humanity across the wire. And for some prisoners, that recognition haunted them more deeply than barbed fences or armed guards. Because if the enemy's women could show mercy, what else had their leaders lied about? Even as nurses and clerks carried out their duties, whispers began to stir through the barracks. Stories circulated about prisoners who had lingered a moment too long in the infirmary, or who had exchanged a shy glance with a Red Cross volunteer. Innocent gestures, an offered blanket, a conversation in broken German, a shared laugh over a mispronounced word, quickly became fodder for rumor. Some prisoners claimed friendships had formed, quiet connections forged across the fence of captivity. Others told darker tales, whispered stories of forbidden romances, of fleeting kisses stolen under the watchful eyes of guards, of letters smuggled back and forth. In a culture where fraternization was strictly forbidden, these stories carried a thrill and a danger. The American military was vigilant. Regulations forbade fraternization, and punishment was swift for those caught crossing the line. Guards patrolled corridors, letters were screened, and suspicious behavior was reported immediately. Yet human curiosity and loneliness were not so easily contained. For prisoners, cut off from families and living in a world turned upside down, these connections, even imagined, offered both comfort and temptation. The psychological effect was profound. Some men wrestled with guilt, wondering if a kind word from a nurse or a polite smile from a clerk amounted to betrayal. Others felt exhilaration, the forbidden nature of the interactions heightening every glance, every gesture. And for the women, who often understood the precarious balance between duty and humanity, the lines were equally delicate. They could care, assist, and enforce rules all at once, but they had to maintain authority above all. Whispers in the barracks grew into quiet debates. Was it compassion or betrayal? The question lingered long after the day's work ended, echoing in the minds of men who had been taught that loyalty and honor were absolute. Here, loyalty was tested not by combat, but by proximity to a stranger who smiled, who cared, who wielded power differently than anything they had ever known. Some letters that made it past censors hinted at this tension, carefully coded. Phrases like, "She helped me stand," or "I owe her respect," carried double meanings, expressing gratitude, awe, and perhaps even longing. Yet every word was shadowed by the knowledge that it could never be spoken openly in Germany, that admitting emotional connections to enemy women would have been seen as shameful. In the quiet nights of the camps, prisoners wrestled with these contradictions. The women were authority figures, caretakers, and in rare cases, objects of fascination or desire. Their presence blurred the lines between duty and intimacy, between power and vulnerability. And in that gray space, the prisoners' beliefs, loyalties, and pride were tested in ways the battlefield had never done. The presence of women in positions of authority was more than a daily shock. It was a quiet revolution in the minds of the prisoners. In Germany, they had been drilled from childhood to accept a rigid social hierarchy. Women were mothers, wives, caretakers of the home, guardians of the hearth. Authority, responsibility, command, these belonged exclusively to men. To see this order inverted was disorienting. As weeks turned into months, some prisoners began to make comparisons they could not ignore. In the barracks, in whispered conversations after lights out, men discussed the stark differences between the world they had left behind and the one inside the wire. "Our women," one muttered, "would never issue an order, never even be heard in public. Here, they command respect." Another replied, almost hesitantly, "And we obey, without argument." It was more than novelty. It was a mirror held up to their own society. For soldiers who had lived under the weight of Nazi ideology, whose very identities had been bound to its rules, the contrast was unsettling. The Americans, they realized, had built a functioning war effort that integrated women seamlessly. Efficiency and authority were not dependent on gender. They were dependent on competence. The psychological effect varied among individuals. Some clung stubbornly to old ideas, rationalizing that this was a temporary anomaly, a peculiarity of the enemy. Others, however, could not help but question. If women could lead, care, and manage without weakening society, what else had the propaganda lied about? Could an entire worldview, so carefully instilled, be fundamentally flawed? Diaries and memoirs reveal the seeds of doubt that took root in these men. One prisoner wrote, "I came here believing women were weak, that our men were superior in every way. But each day I see the opposite. I do not yet understand it, but I feel the round shifting beneath my beliefs. Another noted the humiliation mingled with fascination. I obey orders from a woman, and I am neither punished nor shamed, only made aware that my assumptions were false. It was subtle, almost imperceptible at first. No lecture or propaganda poster could plant doubt like lived experience. The quiet presence of women in authority, the routine enforcement of rules, the patient care in infirmaries, all of it chipped away at assumptions, leaving questions in its wake. By the end of their sentences, many POWs carried these doubts with them, unspoken but persistent. They left the camps not just having survived, but having witnessed a social reality impossible under the ideology they had been taught. And while few would ever write openly about it, the memory of being commanded, assisted, and overseen by women lingered long after the war's end. The barbed wire had confined their bodies, but it had also cracked the foundations of their beliefs. In that quiet psychological shift lay one of the most profound, overlooked legacies of American POW camps. Decades after the war ended, the memories of American prison camps lingered vividly for many German POWs, not for the barracks, the fields, or even the food, but for the women who had moved among them with authority, care, and independence. The shock of seeing women issue orders, oversee work details, and tend to the sick remained etched in their minds like a paradox they could never fully reconcile. Interviews conducted in the 1970s and 1980s reveal a striking pattern. Some former prisoners spoke openly about the respect they had felt for the women in uniform, the way a nurse's steady hands healed not only wounds but doubts, or the way a clerk's efficient management commanded compliance without cruelty. In rare instances, these experiences led to unexpected connections after the war. A number of POWs returned to the United States years later and married American women they had first seen behind the wire, forming bonds that defied ideology, geography, and the scars of conflict. For others, however, the memory carried a heavier burden. To admit the humiliation of taking orders from women, even decades later, felt shameful. Some men avoided the topic entirely with their families, concealing the cognitive dissonance that had haunted them in captivity. Diaries and private letters that survived the censors often hint at unease, fascination, and grudging admiration, but always filtered through a veil of embarrassment. One former prisoner, recalling a nurse who had tended to his fevered body in Pennsylvania, wrote privately, "I obeyed her orders as I would a sergeant, but in my heart I wrestled with pride. Even now I am not sure if it was respect or shame that guided me." Another admitted that the lessons learned in those camps, lessons about authority, competence, and humanity, had subtly shaped his post-war perspective on gender and society, even if he could never voice them publicly. The paradox endured. Captivity had humiliated and educated in equal measure. Men who had been trained to revere strict hierarchies now understood, at least unconsciously, that competence and authority were not bound by gender. In the quiet moments of reflection, many recognized that the shock they had felt was not just personal, it was ideological. The very system that had trained them to see women as subordinate had been quietly undermined by the efficiency, professionalism, and humanity of their captors. For some, the memory remained bittersweet. They had survived the war, returned to their homeland, and built new lives, but the image of the enemy's women walking freely among them, issuing orders with confidence and kindness, lingered as a testament to a world they had once thought impossible. The humiliation, the curiosity, and the subtle admiration coexisted in a complex emotional legacy that would outlast the barbed wire, the guards, and the battles themselves. German POWs arrived on American soil expecting the worst. They imagined cold iron bars, harsh guards, and the gnawing emptiness of hunger. They anticipated cruelty, humiliation, and the kind of suffering that had become synonymous with captivity on the Eastern Front. Yet the reality they encountered was something far stranger, far more disorienting, and far more revealing than any they could have anticipated. Inside these camps, behind fences that marked the boundary of freedom, German soldiers were confronted with a truth that shook the foundations of everything they had been taught. Women could wield authority, command respect, and enforce order with dignity and efficiency. They were nurses who cared, clerks who managed, and in rare instances, guards who patrolled. The enemy's women moved among them, unafraid, competent, and resolute, not as victims, but as keepers of a system that ran smoothly and humanely. The psychological impact was profound. For men indoctrinated in the rigid gender hierarchies of the Reich, this was not simply a curiosity, it was a revelation. Ideology taught them that women were weak, subordinate, and confined to the home. Yet here, in a world foreign and unfamiliar, those assumptions were shattered. Obedience was demanded, respect was earned, and compassion was shown, all by women. It was not merely an encounter with enemy personnel, it was a confrontation with a different worldview. The German prisoners glimpsed a society where competence and authority were not dictated by gender, where humanity and efficiency could coexist, and where order did not require cruelty. In that dissonance, many began to see America in a new light, not just as a distant adversary, but as a country whose principles, culture, and social structure were unlike anything they had known. This experience left a lasting imprint. Some prisoners returned home with stories they could never share, silently carrying lessons about fairness, care, and the subtle power of women in society. Others carried memories that would shape post-war relationships, in rare cases, even inspiring bonds with American women after repatriation. The shock, once immediate and unsettling, evolved into reflection, a recognition that power, leadership, and respect could take forms their ideology had never imagined. And so, in the quiet aftermath of the war, the story of German POWs in American camps became more than a historical footnote. It was a study in the unexpected consequences of captivity, a narrative of cultural collision, and a testament to how even brief encounters can challenge deeply ingrained beliefs. German POWs had expected chains, hunger, and cruelty. Instead, they found something their ideology had never prepared them for: women with power, dignity, and compassion. For those willing to look beyond the barbed wire, the lesson was unmistakable. The battlefield does not always shape the mind, but exposure to new worlds, however confined, can change it forever. Subscribe for more forgotten World War II stories, and join us next time as we uncover another hidden truth from the war's shadowed corners. In the end, the most dangerous weapon inside those camps was not a rifle, a grenade, or the threat of force. It was something far subtler, far more disorienting: the quiet, unyielding presence of freedom itself. It walked among them in crisp uniforms, carried clipboards, tended wounds, and smiled with a confidence that defied every expectation. The German prisoners had been trained to conquer and obey, to see the world in strict hierarchies and absolutes. Yet here, behind wire and watchtower, they were confronted with a power they could neither fight nor ignore. That power was embodied in the women they were never meant to meet. Women who commanded, who cared, who enforced order with authority and grace. Women who turned humiliation into introspection, obedience into revelation, and the ordinary routines of camp life into lessons that would linger for decades. They were, in a sense, the living proof of an entirely different society, a society that challenged the beliefs, pride, and very worldview of men who had thought themselves invincible. It was a quiet revolution, one that left scars and insights that outlasted the war. And though the fences and towers are long gone, the story remains, a hidden chapter of World War II, overlooked yet unforgettable, where authority, compassion, and human connection reshaped even the hardened hearts of soldiers trained for battle. If you found this story as shocking and revealing as we did, make sure to subscribe and hit that like button, and stay tuned. In our next episode, we'll uncover another hidden truth from the shadows of World War II, one that will challenge everything you thought you knew about the war.